Thank you. Thanks very much for coming, folks. I'm going to give a fairly sort of whistle-stop tour, really, I suppose, of placebo effects in sport. And before I do that, I just want to put some context, really, around what I've been doing for about, I guess, almost 10 years now in terms of researching the effect. Just some comments that have been made around the sort of work we've been doing there. Firstly, a response to a journal, a paper submitted in 2007. Sports scientists know about the placebo effect and don't need to be told more about it in papers like this. Not a great thing to receive in a review, but the same paper, the editor actually said this is potentially a landmark paper. We sort of identified fairly early on that we were working in a fairly controversial area, an area that tends to split opinion and tends to bring out the emotions in people. The second one is slightly more troublesome. I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that your research designs are unethical. That was said to me at an interview, a job interview, in 2010. Pretty uncomfortable moment. Although putting some context around that, the same year, the research team can demonstrate a track record of high-quality research using credible, innovative, and elegant research designs. Again, it shows some of the tensions in working in this area. It divides opinion. People believe that, for example, the level of perception we have to use in researching the effect can be ethically problematic. It is. I'll come on to that in a little while. Possibly the most amusing and perhaps prescient was at the bottom. This was 2005, I think. Placebo effect research in sport, you say. Ha ha, good luck funding that. And I think in many respects that proved to be quite a prophetic statement from Dylan Evans, who's now an ex-placebo effect researcher. He's kind of moved on. So anyway, the context really I want to place our work in is that of drugs in sport. I'm not going to labour, I'm not going to really introduce you to the problem because you know the problem. In fact, I understand that several of you work in this particular area. I think the most important piece of information on that slide, though, is that there are currently 73 documented deaths resulting from the use of performance-enhancing drugs in sport. And on the basis that there are 73 documented and deaths, we can be very confident that there is a high level, or a much higher level than that, level of ill health and damaged lives, really, resulting from drug taking. The reason I got into placebo effect work was an interview that I heard on Radio 5 with the gentleman in the photograph there, in which he pretty much put his hands up to having taken drugs, but speculated that lack of knowledge of having taken a drug, he was arguing that his positive test was legitimate, but that he hadn't knowingly taken the substance. His argument was that lack of knowledge of having received the drug was likely to make the drug less effective. His argument was essentially almost saying that unless I know I've taken the drug isn't going to work. Now, at the time, that was an extremely... I remember hearing this thinking, that's an extraordinarily counterintuitive suggestion. My background is in sports science. Whilst I work in a department of psychology, I still see myself as a sports scientist, and sports science is very broad. And my understanding of physiology was... Those of you who know me probably know that my understanding of physiology isn't what it should be, but it was good enough to know that actually if you take certain substances, they tend to work. So this was a fairly counterintuitive suggestion. But when we started looking at some of the research around these sorts of ideas that are fundamentally based around the idea of the placebo effect, it appeared that there was quite a lot of work going on in clinical medicine that supported this idea, supported the idea that knowledge of having received a substance is a fundamental part of that substance effectiveness. And one particular researcher working at that time, still working now, and that's someone who I'm collaborating with at the moment, Fabrizio Benedetti at the Turin Medical School, was doing some very interesting work with clinical patients in placebo effects on pain in clinical patients, using some very, very interesting and elegant designs. And having read some of his research, I decided, as I say, about 10 years ago, to start looking at this particular effect in sport for two reasons. Firstly, I was looking for something to get my teeth into, really. And secondly, because I was really surprised to find that very little work had been done at that point. I think probably 2 or 3 studies had been published into the placebo effect in sport, compared to something like close to 3,000 studies that have been published in clinical medicine, psychology, brain science, etc. I think it's very important. Sam made this point, actually, and I think it's an extremely good point and something that we need to clarify right here. The difference between a placebo effect and a placebo control. A placebo effect is as I put there, a neurophysiological event driven by expectation or conditioning. The placebo control, or what we control for in research, is an experimental condition used to control for a range of potential confounds. And whilst it is easy to confuse the two, what we're going to be talking about today is the former. We're talking about arguably legitimate psychological events that cause a change in overt behaviour, that overt behaviour being sports performance. So myself and a couple of colleagues at Christchurch at the time decided to start looking at the placebo effect. The obvious place to start looking for designs we thought was experimental design textbooks or journal articles. We found, strangely enough, more inspiration in cartoons than we did in textbooks at the time. Now, whilst these aren't hugely funny, you probably can't read those, I'll read those to you in a second. You'll see how these kind of link into our research designs as we go through. On the left, we have a GP on the phone, and he's saying he was unhappy to learn that I prescribed a placebo, but when I told him it was an extra strength placebo, he was pleased. On the right-hand side, this used to be on my office door until a research assistant said that if you're researching the placebo effect, it's probably not a good idea to let people know you're doing it. Find out who set up this experiment. It seems that half the patients were given a placebo and the other half were given a different placebo. Now, both of those, they're kind of mildly amusing. Sam was polite enough to laugh there. But they're kind of mildly amusing, but they kind of hint at some of the paradoxes here. This one hints at a dose-response relationship between placebos and events. This one perhaps hints at the idea that two different placebos might have two different effects, even though both are actually inert. And this kind of catalysed some thinking really about the sort of designs that we should use. And we ended up using two designs, one of which is essentially a modification of the standard placebo-controlled design, and the second is a rather elegant design that's been used by placebo effect researchers looking at substances, for example alcohol and substances used in clinical medicine. So on the left-hand side we have what would be a normal placebo design study, a baseline measure, perhaps a post-baseline measure, and then a number of conditions in which either an active substance, I put caffeine here, it could be an inactive substance, or a placebo is administered. And what we decided to do was simply use this study, inform participants they would be going through this type of design, but instead have placebo conditions in all conditions, so no active substances were given. I'll come back onto this in a second. Balanced placebo design is actually far more subtle and far more exciting to use. For condition design, best used in repeated measures situations, but sometimes that's not always possible. Condition 1, you inform participants they've been given a placebo and they actually receive a placebo. In condition 2, you inform they've been given caffeine but they receive a placebo. In condition 3, you inform they've been given a placebo but give them caffeine, which is both experimentally and ethically problematic condition. And in condition 4, you inform you've given them caffeine and you actually give them caffeine. And the real difference between this design and this design is that this has high ecological validity. Because in the real world, when people take a drug, they know they're taking the drug. So from a psychological point of view, the balanced placebo design has better ecological validity than these types of designs where people have a conditional expectation of having received the substance. And I'll come on to the importance of that again in a second. So what I really want to do for the next sort of 25-30 minutes is, this seems the easiest way of presenting this type of research, is to respond to the 10 most frequently asked questions that I've been confronted by over the last 10 years. Is there a placebo effect in sport? I think you can probably guess the answer to that one. How large is the effect? Can placebos have a negative effect? This, number 4, probably the most frequently asked question, isn't the placebo effect simply a motivational effect? Are the athletes placebo responsive? Can the placebo effect help an athlete in competition? Can a placebo work even when the athlete knows it's a placebo? And this question is the subject of some pretty interesting work going on at the moment. Number 8, can an athlete produce a personal best as a result of ingesting a placebo? Number 9, what are the mechanisms of the effect and what are the potential applications of the placebo effect in sport? And the answer, there's one big question, the answer to which we don't know, or the answer of which we don't know. Is there a placebo effect associated with strong performance-enhancing drugs? As you'll see as I go through this presentation, nearly all of the work that's been conducted, with one or two exceptions, has been conducted on legal overgenic aids, caffeine, creatine, sodium bicarbonate, etc. And very little work has been conducted on the sort of drugs that really represent the problem in sport, drugs such as EPO. And so a huge question mark remains, and that question mark is, are placebo effects really just a function of perhaps the relative, I guess the relative weakness of the substances that are being used? I.e. there's some doubt around the substances. Those substances can be antagonised by a lot of other processes, anything from heat through to stomach contents through to, I'm sure there's a range of potential antagonists, whereas little research has been conducted on substances that have a very powerful effect on performance. I'll come back onto that towards the end of this presentation. So, is there a placebo effect on performance? Reviews indicate, two reviews have been published. There's not a whole lot of research that's experimental or quasi-experimental into placebo effects. Probably 25 or so studies in sport. Generally speaking, there's a small to moderate effect of placebos on sports performance. A wide range of interventions have been used, anything from anabolic steroids in a study in 1972. Morphine, Benedetti has recently used morphine. I'll come on to that study a little later. Carbohydrate, caffeine, sodium bicarbonate. Very few published studies have failed to observe the placebo effect on performance, but I think there's a very good chance that there's a substantial publication bias in the literature. I'm aware of several papers that failed to observe a placebo effect which have not been published, and at the moment only one experimental paper that's failed to find a placebo effect has been published in sports performance. So we've got a small to moderate body of research in sport that suggests that there is a placebo effect on sports performance. Should we be surprised by that? Not at all. That's why we use a placebo control in research. We should expect to find placebo-like effects in any intervention context. How large is the placebo effect? Well, there's substantial variability. Generally speaking, nearly all studies report placebo effects of less than 10% on performance. There's a possible substance and response relationship. Larger effects appear to be reported in relation to anabolic steroids and morphine than is the case with carbohydrate. Larger effects with carbohydrate than is the case with caffeine, sodium bicarbonate, and not surprisingly, larger effects with caffeine and sodium bicarbonate than we see when athletes are correctly informed that they've ingested a placebo. There's also a possible dose-response relationship, which goes back to the cartoon I showed you on the first page. A couple of studies we've done have indicated that when athletes believed they've been given a placebo, when they correctly believe they've been given a placebo, they performed below baseline. And this is a pretty consistent finding. A slightly counterintuitive finding, the idea that if I've been given a placebo, it shouldn't have a negative effect on performance. It should pretty much leave things as they are. But we tend to see this drop compared to baseline. We tend to interview participants in studies after the reveal of the blind in experimental work. And time again, we get the response that, well, I felt a little bit let down, a little bit demotivated when I realised that I wasn't going to be getting an active substance, or when I worked out myself that I hadn't been given an active substance that day. And some of our studies have revealed some interesting dynamics, really, in the way athletes process information about what they've been given. In one of the first studies we did, it's 5 conditions: baseline pre, baseline post, and 3 experimental conditions in which athletes were informed they would get placebo in one condition, low-dose caffeine in another condition, and high-dose caffeine in a third condition, randomly assigned. What was very interesting is that athletes correctly identified in the first condition, most of them correctly identified that they'd been given a placebo. They didn't feel anything. Now, because they identified they'd been given a placebo, they knew that in the second condition they would be getting something. And generally speaking, they didn't identify a particularly big effect in the second condition either. So most of them assumed that they'd been given the low-dose caffeine in the second, which meant that most of them went into the final experimental trial believing and expecting to have the high dose of caffeine in that trial. And of course, that's the trial where we saw the largest effect, because they believed, they anticipated they were going to have the high dose of caffeine. And it was very interesting how very often in triangulating the data, very often you find that athletes report quite profound effects on performance related to the substance they've been given. In the case of caffeine, it's a sense of feeling sharper, feeling more up for it, really feeling concentrated on the task at hand, feeling buzzy. They report caffeine-like effects, which makes the debrief interviews quite interesting because we spend about half an hour talking to them about the study as if they had been given caffeine, and then we debrief, we say, you weren't actually given any caffeine, does that change anything that you feel about the study? And it's quite interesting how athletes try to sort of reinterpret what they've experienced and what they've reported in the light of having been told they didn't actually ingest any caffeine. So we see a kind of dose response, this idea that a small placebo might be less effective than the big placebo. Now, this is consistent with work elsewhere. There's a lot of work that's been conducted into the sort of hierarchy of placebo effects. Placebo capsules are not as effective, not as powerful as placebo injections. And I know that it's quite a horrific thought, placebo surgery, but it has been done. Placebo surgery is more effective than placebo injections. 2 tablets are more effective than 1. Certain colour tablets are more effective than other tablets. We were given a very large batch of capsules by a pharmaceutical company last year, which was nice of them because they're quite expensive things to buy. And we told them what they were doing. They gave us a very big range of colours and sizes. And it's very interesting. You show some of these capsules to athletes, and they'll almost tell you what they think they're going to do. The capsule, irrespective of what's inside it. You show an athlete a black capsule, and we had several comments saying, that doesn't look like it's going to do me much good. It actually looks like it could be counterproductive. Red and white stripy capsule, big red and white stripy capsule, people say time and time again, that looks like it means business. That looks like that's a powerful capsule. And research elsewhere has demonstrated this. And I think gentleman in Hungary has just released a paper in Sport on exactly this, on athletes' perceptions of colours and sizes of performance-enhancing substances. So dose-response relationship has emerged in quite a few of the studies. Can placebos have a negative effect on performance? Well, hypothetically, if we're seeing a dose-response relationship, and that dose-response relationship is a function of the level of belief, i.e. a low level of anticipation leads to a low level of effect, and a high level of anticipation or expectation leads to a high level of effect, then theoretically a negative expectation should lead to a negative effect. And we found that as well. In fact, and again, this is consistent with work elsewhere. In one particular study, this was actually the study that the reviewer took some offence at in 2007, in a study where team sport athletes performed repeat sprints at baseline in an experimental condition, in which one group of athletes were informed that the drug they'd been given would make them run faster, and the other group were told that actually the drug they'd been given, whilst it would enhance their endurance performance, which was going to be a later stage of the study, would likely compromise their repeat sprint performance. We saw quite a nice effect in that speed in the experimental group told the positive information improved in the experimental conditions, speed in the group told the negative information went down in the experimental conditions. And again, when we debriefed athletes after that particular study, we had that rather nice kind of triangulation again, where athletes in the positive conditions reported what they felt were performance-enhancing characteristics of the substance they had taken, and athletes in the negative condition reported what they felt were some of the negative effects. Now, of course, all of these are sort of suggestion effects. We shouldn't be particularly surprised by these. But there are implications for these sorts of findings for an awful lot of sports science research, in that unless we know what athletes are thinking about the intervention, to a certain extent, we can't fully understand the effects that we're observing in the lab. And I'll come back onto that a little later. I suspect this is the most frequently asked question myself and my team have faced, particularly at conferences and in discussions around sort of bars at conferences. The idea that placebo effect is a motivational effect. Give someone a tablet, tell them it's going to make them go faster, they're going to try harder. And yes, there's absolutely no doubt that that is part of the effect. However, what we have found, and we've found this repeatedly, as have other researchers, is a motivational effect should theoretically be associated with a change in physiological load. We'd expect to see some increase in physiological stress associated with a deliberate, a voluntary increase in, for example, power output in cycling. Now, in some studies we've observed that, and quite interestingly, very often interview data triangulate that. People say, yeah, I just tried harder. I went out harder. I felt more confident to go out harder. And you can see that confidence and that going out harder in the data. There's a change in the physiology very early in that performance compared to baseline performance. However, what we also have noted in some trials is we see improved performance in the absence of significant changes in physiology. Or in other occasions we've seen the same level of performance with reductions in apparent reductions in physiological load. So something is happening. Either there is a greater economy of performance or there is a high level of performance at the same workload. It's very, very, very hard to disentangle motivation from other processes that might drive apparent placebo effects in performance. But there certainly are motivational factors alongside other factors. Are athletes placebo responsive? We tend to see a much larger standard deviation in experimental conditions than we do at baseline, suggesting larger variability in response to the placebo intervention. We also find that there's a big range between studies. We can have as high as 75% of athletes placebo responding in one study and as low as 25 in others. In fact, in one study we conducted, we had, I believe, 2 or 3 athletes who appeared to be definitively placebo responsive amongst 12 athletes. It's very hard to say whether an athlete has definitively responded, because again there's a number of variables. However, we do our best to triangulate the lab data with interview data, with questionnaire data. We've looked at whether personality might predict placebo responsiveness, and we failed at every attempt to do that. We're fairly confident that placebo response is unlikely a stable characteristic of the athlete. And to a certain extent that finding has been supported by the observation that some athletes will placebo respond in one trial of a study and not in another. And interestingly, very often when you try and tease out in interview why that might have been, they may have some very good reasons for that. We were quite worried early on in conducting placebo effect research that what we were observing was a pretty random collection of events, random fluctuations in performance, and if they happen to coincide with an intervention might give the appearance of there being a legitimate placebo effect. So we don't see any real patterns in terms of personality predictors. Can any athlete placebo respond? I'm pretty confident, given the right context, yes, because the placebo response does appear to be ubiquitous. However, the idea of context is critical there. There's a suggestion that the more elite the athlete, the less placebo responsive they're likely to be. Some data seem to support this suggestion, however other data don't support that idea. It makes intuitive sense that a more experienced athlete, an athlete who knows their physiology, knows their performance better, is less likely to be to succumb, shall we say, to the power of suggestion. However, that idea has been undermined by quite a few of the interviews we've conducted where quite experienced athletes have said, for example, in one particular study, an athlete who used caffeine an awful lot during their career and who was very aware of the effects of caffeine on performance, had stopped using caffeine several years ago for a number of reasons, but who sat down and in the interview told us exactly what he expected caffeine to do to his performance, and pretty much told us that that's exactly what the caffeine had done to his performance. He said it was almost like, I can't remember the exact word he used, but he said it was almost like getting an old friend back. Had that sense of, there we are again, I can feel the effect again. Very experienced athlete, very experienced not just in terms of performance, but at using caffeine. He spent perhaps 15 years of his competitive life using caffeine. So it's very, very hard to pin down any particular trends around whether a more experienced or less experienced athlete might be more placebo responsive, whether personality might predict this. We hypothesised, for example, that neuroticism might relate to placebo responding. There's some quite intuitively compelling arguments that one of the mechanisms of placebo responding in sport might be reduced anxiety, leading to more economic performance, leading to apparently greater performance output. But we, as I said, we found no clear trends in that respect. Can the placebo effect help an athlete in competition? Will Hopkins, as early as 1999, was arguing that the placebo effect was a laboratory phenomenon. It was an artifact of the laboratory environment, unlikely to be a factor in in elite sport. He had quite a good argument, to be honest. I can't remember the full details of that argument, but it was a well-made argument. There isn't much anecdotal evidence for real-world placebo effects, but of course the problem with anecdotal evidence is that it's just that. It's uncontrolled. It is subject to so many variables and so many unknowns and so much subjectivity that despite the fact that many of the accounts are very compelling, I think for me the most compelling account was that of Willie Vogt describing I can't remember the cyclist's name. Michel Vironk. Yeah, when he was talking about one of Vironk's greatest performances was where Vironk felt that or believed that he'd been given shall we say, a fairly potent performance-enhancing substance. But according to Willie Vogt, he was given nothing of the sort before that particular event. Now, a lot of these accounts are very compelling, and they built up a kind of a pop psychology around the placebo effect in sport. And sometimes I find myself, it would be wrong to say that I cringe when I see my work cited on some of the web pages on which it is cited. But there is this idea that somehow the placebo effect is all powerful, and the placebo effect is what it's going to take you to the next level in your performance. And I've seen our work cited on, particularly on bodybuilding websites, where the work is taken completely out of context, and where examples like that of Willie Vogt are used very much out of context and with very little evidence. However, I see no reason why an effect that is evident in the lab would not be evident in the field, simply because the lab and the field are actually, in sports terms, are fairly similar settings. There's a lot of control in sports terms in terms of, I do laboratory research in psychology, and the real world and the psychology lab are two entirely different places. Whereas the real world of sport and the sports science lab are far more consistent. However, there's quite a lot of research now emerging of real-world placebo effects. Phil Hurst and the guys down at Canterbury have just produced quite a nice study looking at 5K track time trial. And they found they've used the balanced placebo design that I introduced to you earlier. What they found is fairly unclear effects in total placebo given placebo and in total placebo given caffeine, but very likely beneficial effects in both the told caffeine given placebo and in the told caffeine given caffeine phases. Now what's interesting there, of course, is that what appears to be the mechanism there isn't the caffeine, but it's the being told you've been given caffeine. It's consistent with some work that Dave Collins did a few years back as well, where he concluded the same thing. It was the information that was the powerful performance-enhancing component of the intervention, not the substance itself. Now, of course, it will be an interaction of the two, and I've got quite a nice slide later demonstrating that interaction. But certainly the idea that placebo effects are limited to the laboratory is likely flawed. But I am very sceptical about some of the claims made for placebo effects in sort of narrative accounts, and we certainly need more field work to look at these. This question really is, from so many levels, such an interesting question. Ted Capture at Harvard Medical School published a paper 2 or 3 years ago reporting placebo effects in response to open-labelled placebos. Open-labelled means we tell the recipient that this is a placebo. So the recipient comes into the laboratory and we say, this is a placebo. Or as I put it here in terms of what we said in a sports study, this is a placebo. Placebos have been found to improve sports performance by up to 5% in a number of scientific studies. Now what Ted Capture found was that in a couple of relatively minor health conditions that he was studying, I believe one of them being IBS, certainly health conditions that have a large subjective stroke psychological component, he was finding that placebos, open-label placebos, were effective. I was contacted by a newspaper a few years ago when this first came out, and I was asked what I thought about this, and I said, well, I think it's probably a fairly non-representative finding, and what we'll probably find is as we go forwards that when athletes or when anyone is told it's a placebo, we won't see an effect. However, Capture replicated his findings. We decided to do a pilot study last year looking at the open labelling of placebos in sport. With 12 athletes on the Cooper run test, we found a mean improvement of 2.8%. Now, it's not substantial, and it was a pilot study, but and it wasn't on elite athletes. I think it's very important to mention that. But it's interesting, this idea that it goes back to what I said in relation to the previous slide. There's a kind of folk psychology around the placebo effect building up. And it's very interesting that Kapchuk, when one of his participants was interviewed for a television show last year, a Horizon show last year, she reported how she went to a pharmacy in the United States. She walked in and asked for placebo. And apparently the pharmacist looked at her as if she was mad. She said, well, no, my doctor's been prescribing me placebo and it's cured me, but I'm not in the trial anymore. I can't get any more placebo. Can you give me some placebo, please? Now, there's a couple of interesting points about this. Firstly, as we found to our cost, placebos are extraordinarily expensive. They are ironically more expensive than the drugs that they're purporting to be. Because high quality, well, not always, but certainly in some situations, high quality placebo, pharmacology grade placebo is extremely expensive. We make our own now because we have to. So this lady walked into this pharmacy and said, I'd like some placebo. And when interviewed further, it's clear that there's this sense that this growing understanding that placebos are somehow powerful might actually be changing the findings of this type of research, because people did this. We found 10 years ago that open label placebos led to a negative effect on sports performance. Yet we found this year, or last year, that open label placebos led to a positive effect on sports performance. Now, there's certainly something in the way we're messaging participants. To a certain extent, I suspect that when we talked to participants 10 years ago, we didn't want placebos, open label placebos, to be effective. No matter how much we try and control how we communicate with athletes, perhaps some of that was coming through. Now, I strongly suspect that in this intervention, part of what we were saying was coming through as we want these to be effective, because the language had slightly changed. Placebos have been found to improve sports performance. It's not the whole truth, but neither is it a lie. It's an interesting intervention to use. So what's happened really over the sort of last 10, 15 years in placebo effect research elsewhere is that people like Benedetti are using robust neurophysiological indices to examine placebo effects and finding a very solid neurophysiological basis for effects. And interestingly, what Benedetti is finding is that the effects often often use the pathways of the drug that they purport to represent. So, for example, placebo morphine can be antagonized by naloxone, which is an opioid agonist, whereas placebo effects of other substances are not antagonized by opioid agonists, which suggests that there's some specificity around the pathways. So there's this wonderful sort of contrast between this really hard science that people like Benedetti do, and then this kind of almost completely nonsensical findings of people like Kapchuk and latterly ourselves. To be honest, I really don't want to publish this until I've replicated it. I don't want to publish it until I've replicated it, which is something we hope to do this summer on a larger cohort and on a more homogeneous group of athletes, so that we can be far more confident in our findings. But it does show how ideas permeate culture. And when I first started researching the placebo effect, I guess, whilst the internet certainly wasn't in its infancy, it isn't what it is now. And I remember I would search for certain placebo-related phenomena and find relatively few hits. Now, if I search placebo effect, I'm confronted by hundreds of thousands of hits around the power of the placebo, the power to heal yourself, all of these sorts of ideas, which are clearly sort of permeating and might be permeating in sport as well. Regarding the mechanisms, what are the mechanisms? As I say, we debrief after every study, and we find a fairly common set of proposed mechanisms. Motivation, I felt more up for it. Pain reduction, the pain just went away. Emotion, I felt calmer and less tense. Pacing, I went out hard and was able to hold it there. Obviously, pacing relates to motivation, this idea that I believe I've received a helpful intervention, I'm going to push it just that little bit harder. Physiology, my body seemed to switch into a different mode, it just did things more efficiently. We got some wonderful stories from athletes in relation to this last one, probably the most compelling being from a firefighter who was in a cycling study. He was also a very good cyclist. And he talked about when he goes into a building with a respirator on his back. He knows that should things go wrong, it's the contents of that respirator, the contents of that tank on his back that is going to save his life, that's going to make the difference. And he says that he learned long ago that as soon as that mouthpiece goes on, he starts to economise. He says he can feel his body change when he puts the mask on. He knows he has to be different. He knows he has to look after the resources available to him. And he made a he gave a very eloquent account of how, when we gave him what he believed was a very high dose of caffeine before a performance trial, he felt the same sort of thing happening. He felt this sense of the body calming, the sense of his physiology changing in response to this substance. So it raises all sorts of questions about the routines that athletes use, the beliefs that athletes have, the interaction of all of these different variables at the point at which they're given a particular substance that can have an effect on how that substance is manifest on performance. But certainly what we find from athletes is that very often their narrative accounts agree with the data they told us. And specifically, we found a high level of agreement between athletes who tell us they were just trying harder, they felt more up for it, they pushed harder, and changes in physiology that are absent in athletes who say, no, it just felt easier. It just felt easier, I felt more on top of it. So there is some degree of triangulation between physiological and self-report data that suggests that there are some legitimate mechanisms underlying these, and that these mechanisms are most likely related to pain, emotional responses and physiological responses. As Sam very kindly mentioned, we were lucky enough to do a Horizon last year, and it was a really, really interesting experience. And probably one of the most interesting aspects of it was the production team's absolutely desperate quest for a personal best. That from the very first discussion, we're probably discussing this programme over 6 months, one of the core questions that emerged in all discussion was, are we likely to see a personal best amongst any of these athletes? Now, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it was very fortunate for the programme. We were using some pretty good athletes. So my constant response was, it's unlikely. It's unlikely that we're going to see a personal best, and I'm sorry if that really undermines the story you can tell in your TV programme, but the reality is we don't often see athletes coming off a piece of lab equipment having produced something extraordinary. We sometimes see 3, 4, 5% greater level of performance in experimental than baseline, but I don't believe that athletes in the lab are often competing at their absolute maximum anyway. So we were very, very, very surprised when in the last trial of the last session at Manchester Velodrome, one of the riders produced a PB. We were very surprised. The film crew, very, very, very scientific film crew, wonderfully intelligent people, wonderfully committed people. It was great to see them jumping up and down, waving their hands in the air in response to this. The athlete himself was very surprised as well. And the quote we got from him at the end of that was, I can't believe it, I thought I was taking all my usual supplements, I felt great going into the ride, I felt great in the ride, and I produced the best time I've ever done. They tell me that what I've taken was a placebo. I'm really not sure I need to take the stuff anymore. Now, I'm going to come on to the implications of that in just a second. But it was interesting. A number of things were interesting about this particular athlete. Firstly, he was taking an awful lot of supplements. He'd stopped taking them for this particular session. And that could have been a factor in his performance, who knows. And what was interesting is his belief about the supplements. His belief about, he's one of those people who was utterly convinced you cannot get the best out of yourself unless you're using absolutely everything that you possibly can that's legal. So to a certain extent, he's the sort of person we would expect to placebo respond. If we tell him that we've given him something just that little bit better, just that little bit more new, just a little bit more high-tech. But it was this last sentence, I'm really not sure I need to take the stuff anymore, that was really compelling. And this goes back, this takes us back to 12 years to our first study in which we heard exactly that from a cyclist who was using high doses of caffeine, a number of substances. And what was interesting about his use of caffeine is that he was getting some quite pathological side effects from using caffeine. So he'd often be absolutely exhausted after training, bad-tempered after training. You'd find that was far worse after training sessions when he'd used caffeine. So he was aware of some of the negative effects of even something as as relatively weak as caffeine on his life beyond sport. And he said exactly that as well. Given that I can perform that well without caffeine, why would I need to be using caffeine and seeing these negative effects of caffeine? Of course, we've got to be a bit careful here, because I talked earlier about nocebo effects, and I think this is a story that Louis heard before, so I apologise. We did have one subject in a study who experienced extraordinary negative side effects to caffeine in the study. He believed that he was getting 9 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. He was quite a big lad, and he, midway through one of the trials, started to feel sick, started to feel nauseous. We had to go through the normal response procedures in the lab. At that stage, we didn't tell him that he hadn't been given caffeine, but we did pretty soon afterwards. He didn't believe us. He actually accused us of poor hygiene in the lab. He accused us of poor controls. He was quite angry about it, but actually once we discussed the situation with him, he was able to laugh, and interestingly it turned out he'd actually at one point been a pharmacologist. But what was very clear is that he expected negative side effects of caffeine, and we observed that nocebo effect not on performance, although clearly it was on performance, but on other measures as well. But turning back to this, we've heard on a number of occasions athletes say, this makes me question why I should be using ergogenic aids. And this really comes on to the core point of any research is, what is the application? I started studying the placebo effect because I found it interesting. I found it counterintuitive, and no one else was doing it at that particular time. And I have to say, for quite a long time, we really struggled in terms of the application, potential application. I saw potential applications really as a sports psychologist in the domain of performance enhancement. The idea that if someone can placebo respond, it suggests that there's a gap, there's headroom between what they're actually capable of, should we say in crude terms, what they're capable of physiologically and what they're currently doing. There's a gap, and that gap is filled perhaps by the placebo effect. And my kind of early thinking was that, well, if we can identify placebo-responsive athletes, then that is evidence almost for the need for an intervention to close that gap between current level of performance and possible level of performance. But to a certain extent, this didn't really excite me hugely. It presented all sorts of problems in terms of how we actually identify whether an athlete is placebo-responsive in any really reliable manner. What became more, or to say so, identifying whether an athlete is highly placebo-responsive. What became more interesting and more obvious over time was that there was clearly an anti-doping context. And that was interesting because that was the catalyst for me getting into this research in the first place. And this idea that the demonstration of the placebo effect to athletes might actually change their views about the use of performance-enhancing substances, both legal and illegal, became stronger really over the years. And I think really it's got us to the point where we are now looking at this particular approach to the use of placebo effect research with Phil Hurst down and Damien Coleman and Abby Foad down at Canterbury. We're using standard measures to evaluate athletes' existing attitudes towards drug effectiveness, towards drug mechanisms, and the likelihood of their own future drug use. We're then using one of two interventions. The first intervention is an experiential intervention. We actually get them into the lab, we enroll them in a standard placebo study, and we demonstrate the placebo effect directly. Now, of course, that doesn't work with all athletes, but with about 50 or 60% of athletes, we'll see placebo responses that the athletes recognise as such. So the athlete themselves experiences a placebo effect. The second intervention is an educational intervention where we use data that we've collected, interviews that we've collected, video clips, all sorts of information to pull together an educational intervention which informs the athletes about the placebo effect, about the potential of the placebo effect to enhance performance, about some of the mechanisms, and about the potential implications for sports performance. And then we're evaluating any changes in those pre-test measures in drug effectiveness, drug mechanisms, and likelihood of future drug use. And it's kind of interesting because, I mean, all of these are hypotheticals. I'm no great fan of self-report, and you can never be overly sure of the degree to which any of these changes are reliable changes, or any of these changes are directly attributable to these two interventions. But it's a step in the right direction, and that's, for me, it's about applying placebo effect research in an important area. But there is still really, for me, one major problem in placebo effect research, which is that all of the work that's been done, with two exceptions, and there are problems with both of those two exceptions, has been done on weak substances, legal substances, and substances that have a relatively small effect on performance. The substances might have quite big effects on performance amongst some, but generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that the fact that they're legal probably suggests that the effects on performance are not huge. Anti-doping applications are likely only relevant if placebo effects associated with the drugs that athletes are actually using, with the problem drugs that athletes are actually using. So when I tell an athlete about caffeine, or creatine, or sodium bicarbonate, there's a likelihood that the response is going to be, but is there a placebo effect of EPO? Because they're the drugs that matter, they're the problem drugs. So what is probably really missing in the placebo effect literature, in the anti-doping context, is a large, reliable study of whether there is a placebo effect associated with one or more of the problem drugs in sport. And that's something that myself and some colleagues are working on currently. Using the balanced placebo design, we're certain to identify the psychological and pharmacological contribution to the performance enhancing effects of one or more illegal substances. And I think in terms of answering questions about drug mechanisms, we know the physiological pathways of many drugs. But what research has demonstrated time and time again, certainly Benedetti's research has demonstrated, is that the placebo often uses those same pathways. So this doesn't by any means suggest that those drugs aren't effective. No one's suggesting that morphine isn't effective. What Benedetti's work suggests is that when there is a placebo associated with those, it can use the same pathways, and that if those pathways can be tapped into via other means, there might be a potential anti-doping intervention that can be developed from that. So just to summarise, in terms of placebo effects in sport, placebo effects have the potential to influence many athletes in both the lab and in competition. While some examples of placebo effects are likely motivational, others have also been observed in the absence of changes in physiology. Placebo responding is unlikely a stable trait. We seem to find that while some athletes respond all the time and others don't respond at all, most athletes seem to be capable of responding in one situation and perhaps not in another. And those contextual factors really need a lot more teasing out before we be confident about predicting a response in any one person in any one situation. Mechanisms vary, but motivation, pain reduction, reduced sense of effort and emotional responses are those most frequently cited. And I think this is an important slide to finish with, which is really a sort of summary of the sort of where we're at with placebo responses in the real world, including sport, but certainly more importantly including clinical medicine. In the absence of a biological intervention, the belief that you've taken a drug might result in a therapeutic outcome, and a negative expectation of the drug might result in an undesirable response. In the presence of a biological intervention, knowledge that you've taken the drug might augment the biological effect. Ignorance of having taken the drug might offset some of the biological effects, whilst negative expectations of the drug might antagonise the biological effect. And I think the implications for a number of aspects of sports science, both in terms of applications, applied and research applications of sports science, are fairly clear from those research findings. I think that took slightly longer than I'd anticipated. I do apologise for that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.